Today, we are exploring the dark depths of this evil man.
We all had this sensation that an act of war was really taking place.
Has been asking us, how can one person do this?
He drew his pistol and he shot them both in the head.
The killer's own father said he wished his son had committed suicide.
On July 22nd, 2011, Norway experienced its darkest day since World War II when a pair of coordinated attacks left 77 people dead and dozens more injured. Anders Behring Breivik, a far-right extremist, carried out a devastating bombing in Oslo's government district before launching a brutal shooting spree on Utoya Island, targeting young members of the Labour Party. Part 1. The Day of the Attack. The 2011 Norway attacks began on a peaceful summer afternoon that quickly turned into a national nightmare. On July 22, 2011, at around 3:25 p.m., a massive explosion shook Oslo, the capital of Norway. The bomb exploded in the government quarter, an area housing several important government offices, including the Prime Minister's office. The blast was deafening and caused severe destruction. Windows shattered, cars were overturned, and nearby buildings were heavily damaged. Smoke and debris filled the air, leaving the area in chaos. People nearby were thrown off their feet by the force of the explosion. Many were injured, while others fled in fear. Unsure of what was happening, emergency services arrived quickly, but the damage was overwhelming. The explosion killed 8 people and injured more than 200 others. Rescue workers searched through rubble, hoping to find survivors, while firefighters worked to control the fires caused by the blast. It was clear that this was not an accident. Investigators immediately suspected a bomb. At first, authorities believed the explosion might have been an attack on Norway's government by a foreign terrorist group. The scale of the blast and its location suggested a politically motivated attack. However, before they could fully understand the situation in Oslo, reports of another attack began to emerge. Less than 2 hours after the bombing, at around 5 p.m., news came in of a shooting on Utoya, a small island about 25 miles northwest of Oslo. Utoya was hosting a summer camp for the Workers' Youth League, AUF, a group connected to the Labour Party, Norway's ruling political party at the time. The camp was filled with young people, mostly teenagers, who were enjoying the event. Initial reports were unclear, but survivors described hearing gunshots and screams. They saw a man in a police uniform walking around the island with a gun, shooting at anyone he encountered. The man claimed he was there for security reasons, which allowed him to approach the campers without raising suspicion at first. When the shooting began, panic broke out. Many campers ran for their lives, hiding in bushes or jumping into the cold waters of the nearby lake to escape. The shooter showed no mercy, targeting the campers even as they tried to swim away. Survivors later said they had never experienced such terror in their lives. Emergency calls flooded in from Utoya, but it took police nearly an hour to arrive due to the island's location and confusion caused by the earlier bombing. By the time the police reached Utoya at 6:34 p.m., the attacker had killed 69 people, most of them teenagers, and injured dozens more. Authorities soon confirmed that the two attacks were connected. The man responsible for the shootings on Utoya, Anders Behring Breivik, had also planted the bomb in Oslo. His actions were part of a coordinated plan to spread fear and target Norway's political system. Part 2. Background of Anders Behring Breivik. To understand the man behind the 2011 Norway attacks, it is important to explore Anders Behring Breivik's life and what led him to commit such heinous crimes. Breivik was born on February 13, 1979, in Oslo, Norway. He grew up in a middle-class family, but his childhood was far from stable. Breivik's parents divorced when he was just a year old. His father, Jens Breivik, was a diplomat, and his mother, Ventje Behring, worked as a nurse. After the divorce, Anders lived with his mother and had little contact with his father. Reports suggest that his early years were troubled, with claims of neglect and emotional abuse. A social services investigation when Breivik was 4 years old raised concerns about his mother's behavior, but he remained in her care. As a child, Breivik was described as intelligent but socially awkward. He struggled to make close friends and often felt like an outsider. He attended school in Oslo and showed an interest in politics and history, but his teenage years were marked by rebellion. He became involved in minor criminal activities such as graffiti and shoplifting, which strained his relationship with his family. Breivik tried several career paths, including working in customer service and running a company that sold fake diplomas online. While he was financially successful for a brief period, his attempts often failed, leaving him frustrated and isolated. In his 20s, Breivik began to adopt extreme political views. He became critical of Norway's multicultural policies, which he believed were undermining Norwegian culture and identity. Breivik blamed the Labour Party and its associated groups for what he saw as the erosion of traditional Norwegian values. He also developed a strong hatred for immigrants, particularly Muslims, whom he viewed as a threat to Europe. By his early 30s, Breivik had become deeply immersed in far-right ideology. He spent hours on the internet, reading and engaging with extremist forums. He admired other far-right figures and began to see himself as part of a broader struggle to defend Western civilization. Breivik's writings show that he was obsessed with the idea of creating a cultural revolution to overthrow governments that supported multiculturalism. Breivik also spent years meticulously planning his attacks. He created a manifesto titled 2083, a European Declaration of Independence, which outlined his beliefs and the reasoning behind his actions. In the document, he detailed his opposition to feminism, Marxism, and Islam, blaming these forces for what he called the destruction of Europe. He claimed to be a member of a secret organization called the Knights Templar, although no evidence of such a group has been found. To prepare for his attacks, Breivik trained himself both physically and mentally. He joined a shooting club to improve his firearm skills and practiced using explosives. He even isolated himself for long periods to avoid drawing suspicion. Breivik's isolation and radicalization deepened in the years leading up to the attacks. He moved to a rural farmhouse outside Oslo, where he could work on his plans without interference. There, he stockpiled weapons and explosives, rehearsing every detail of his plan. By the time he carried out his attacks on July 22, 2011, he was fully committed to his twisted ideology and believed he was starting a war. Part 3. The Attacks. At approximately 3:25 p.m., Breivik detonated a massive car bomb outside the government quarter in central Oslo. The explosive was concealed inside a white delivery van that he had parked near the main office of the Prime Minister. While Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg was not in the building at the time, the explosion caused widespread devastation. The bomb, made using fertilizer and fuel oil, created a powerful blast that damaged several buildings, shattered windows, and sent debris flying through the air. 8 people were killed in the explosion, and over 200 others were injured, some critically. The attack left a deep crater in the ground and rendered the area unrecognizable. Emergency services arrived quickly to assist the injured and search for survivors. Chaos and confusion gripped Oslo as people struggled to comprehend what had happened. At first, authorities suspected that the bombing might be the work of an international terrorist group. However, they would soon learn that the true perpetrator was closer to home. After the bombing, Breivik donned a police uniform and loaded his vehicle with firearms and ammunition. He drove to a ferry terminal about 25 miles northwest of Oslo, heading toward Utoya Island. Utoya was hosting the annual summer camp of the Labour Party's youth wing, the Workers' Youth League, AUF. This gathering was a long-standing tradition and a place where young people discussed political ideas, made friends, and enjoyed recreational activities. At approximately 5:30 p.m., Breivik arrived at the ferry terminal, presenting himself as a police officer, sent to provide security in light of the Oslo bombing. Carrying his weapon and ammunition in cases marked police equipment, he convinced the ferry operator to take him to the island. His calm demeanor and uniform allowed him to avoid suspicion. Once on Utoya, Breivik began his rampage. At around 5:50 p.m., he opened fire on the campers, targeting both staff and participants. He moved methodically across the island, shooting indiscriminately at anyone he encountered. Many of the victims were teenagers, some as young as 14 years old. Panic spread as people tried to escape. Some hid in buildings, under rocks, or in the dense woods. Others jumped into the freezing waters of the Tyrifjord in a desperate attempt to swim to safety. Breivik pursued them relentlessly, shooting at those who were swimming and returning to find those who were hiding. The police received multiple emergency calls from Utoya, but there was significant delay in their response due to logistical challenges. The island's remote location and the need to coordinate a tactical approach complicated their efforts. By the time the police reached Utoya at 6:25 p.m., Breivik had surrendered without resistance. He claimed that he had accomplished his mission. In the 72 minutes between the start of the attack and his capture, Breivik killed 69 people on the island, most of them young attendees of the camp. Dozens more were injured. Survivors later described the terror they experienced and the unimaginable loss of their friends and loved ones. In total, 77 people lost their lives in the Oslo bombing and the Utoya massacre. In the hours after the attacks, Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg addressed the nation, calling for unity and compassion in the face of tragedy. Part 4. The Investigation. The investigation into the 2011 Norway attacks began almost immediately after Anders Behring Breivik was apprehended on Utoya Island. With the nation reeling from the tragedy, authorities worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of his actions, motives, and possible connections to other groups or individuals. The process was thorough, uncovering not only how the attacks were carried out, but also the disturbing ideology that drove them. Following his arrest, Breivik identified himself to the police and immediately claimed responsibility for both the Oslo bombing and the Utoya massacre. However, he refused to plead guilty, asserting that his actions were necessary to protect Norway from multiculturalism and what he described as an Islamic invasion. Authorities quickly confirmed that Breivik had acted alone. There was no evidence linking him to any terrorist organizations, despite his claims of being part of a larger network called the Knights Templar. His insistence on this fabricated group was later dismissed as a product of his delusional thinking. The investigation teams uncovered substantial forensic evidence tying Breivik to the attacks. The Oslo bombing. Authorities recovered remnants of the vehicle used in the bombing, confirming it was the white van Breivik had purchased and modified for the attack. Materials used to construct the bomb, including fertilizer and fuel oil, were traced back to Breivik's purchases in the months leading up to the attacks. Surveillance footage showed him parking the van outside the government buildings just minutes before the explosion. Utoya massacre. On the island, police recovered the firearms Breivik used, a Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle and a Glock pistol. Both weapons were legally purchased in Norway, although Breivik had also stockpiled ammunition and other equipment over several years. Witness testimonies and forensic analysis confirmed his involvement beyond any doubt. The police also searched Breivik's farm in Rena, where they found chemicals, bomb-making equipment, and detailed plans for the attacks. The site was a key piece of evidence in understanding the meticulous preparation that went into his crimes. Investigators also sought to understand Breivik's motives, leading to the discovery of a 1,500-page manifesto titled 2083, a European Declaration of Independence. He had emailed the document to over 1,000 recipients just hours before the attacks began. The manifesto revealed Breivik's extremist ideology, which included anti-Islamic, anti-feminist, and anti-multicultural beliefs. It outlined his perceived threats to Western culture and detailed his preparations for the attacks. The manifesto also described his desire to inspire others to commit similar acts, framing himself as a martyr for his cause. Breivik claimed he was part of a larger group, but investigators found no evidence to support this. His talk about a Knights Templar network was seen as a fantasy to make himself seem more important and justify his actions. Since there were no co-conspirators, investigators concluded that Breivik was a lone wolf terrorist acting alone based on his own beliefs, without orders from anyone else. Survivors and witnesses played a key role in the investigation. Their stories helped create a timeline of the attacks and showed the psychological and physical impact of Breivik's actions. Many survivors from Utoya said Breivik used a police uniform to make them feel safe before he started shooting. Their stories showed the fear and chaos of the attack, but also the bravery of those who tried to help others. The investigation also looked at how the emergency services responded. While the police were praised, the delay in reaching Utoya raised concerns about how prepared they were for such events. After this, changes were made to improve response times and communication during crises. By the end of the investigation, there was clear evidence of Breivik's guilt, and he was charged with terrorism and mass murder. Part 5. The Confession. After his arrest on Utoya Island, Anders Behring Breivik openly admitted to the Oslo bombing and the Utoya shooting, showing no regret for what he had done. His confession was shocking, not just for the details he shared, but because he insisted his actions were justified. From the beginning, Breivik seemed calm and proud when talking about the attacks. He told police he carried them out as part of a mission to save Norway from multiculturalism and what he believed was the growing influence of Islam. Breivik called himself a commander of a group he named the Knights Templar. He claimed this group was part of a larger network of people like him, fighting against what they saw as threats to Western culture. However, investigators found no proof that this group was real, suggesting Breivik made it up to justify his actions and make himself seem more important. He said he spent years preparing, learning to make explosives and gathering weapons and ammunition. His detailed approach showed he wanted to cause as much harm as possible. He explained that he chose his targets to send a political message. The government buildings in Oslo symbolized what he called the multicultural elites, and the youth camp on Utoya Island represented future leaders of the Labour Party, which he blamed for supporting immigration. Breivik saw the young people as legitimate targets, an idea that shocked even experienced investigators. Breivik often mentioned his manifesto, 2083, a European Declaration of Independence, during his confession. He believed it explained his actions and would inspire others to follow him. The manifesto described his extremist beliefs, his fear of a threat to Europe, and his reasons for attacking specific groups. He claimed the manifesto was also a guide for future attacks, explaining every step he took to help others do the same. Breivik argued his attacks weren't about hatred, but were necessary to defend Norway and Europe. He called himself a patriot, referred to his victims as traitors, and said their deaths were part of a bigger fight. He gave graphic details about how he carried out the attacks, speaking about them with a disturbing lack of emotion. He saw the attacks as a personal victory, not a crime. One of the most controversial parts of his confession was his claim that he drank a mix of caffeine and ephedrine to stay focused and block his feelings. He admitted he hesitated before starting the shooting, but quickly reminded himself of his mission. Part 6. The Trial. The trial of Anders Behring Breivik, held in 2012, was one of the most important and emotional court cases in Norway's history. It gave the legal system the tough job of dealing with unprecedented violence, while ensuring both justice and the rights of the accused. The trial also forced Norway to confront the extremism behind the attacks. On April 16, 2012, Breivik appeared in the Oslo District Court. Dressed in a suit, he gave a fascist salute. Throughout the trial, Breivik remained calm, often smiling or nodding as witnesses described the events of July 22, 2011. The trial lasted 10 weeks and included testimony from survivors, victims' families, law enforcement, and psychologists. Some parts of the trial were broadcast live, allowing the public to see how the justice system handled Breivik's crimes. Breivik faced 77 counts of murder, as well as charges of attempted murder and property damage. Prosecutors argued that the attacks were carefully planned acts of terrorism driven by far-right extremism. Breivik pleaded not guilty, claiming his actions were necessary to protect Norway from cultural decline. He compared his crimes to a military operation and continued to justify the violence. His defense team argued that he was not insane, saying his actions were based on deeply held beliefs. Breivik himself rejected the idea that he was insane as he felt it would weaken his message and make his actions seem meaningless. A key issue during the trial was Breivik's mental state. 2 separate psychiatric evaluations were conducted, but they reached different conclusions. The first said he had paranoid schizophrenia and was legally insane. The second said there was no sign of psychosis and that he was fully aware of his actions. The court agreed with the second evaluation, declaring Breivik sane and responsible for his crimes. This decision allowed for the maximum sentence under Norwegian law and confirmed that his actions were motivated by ideology, not mental illness. On August 24, 2012, the court found Breivik guilty of terrorism and premeditated murder. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison, the maximum punishment in Norway, with the possibility of extensions if he is still considered a threat. The sentence caused mixed reactions. Some felt it was justice, while others thought it was too lenient for such serious crimes. Norway's legal system, which focuses on rehabilitation over punishment, was criticized by those who wanted harsher penalties. Throughout the trial, Breivik showed no remorse and used the courtroom to promote his extremist views. His attitude was disturbing, but the court refused to give him the attention he wanted, staying focused on the evidence and the victims' voices. Part 7. The Aftermath. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, Norway entered a period of profound mourning. Vigils were held across the country, with people gathering to honor the 77 lives lost and to support the survivors and victims' families. Flowers, candles, and heartfelt messages were placed at public spaces and near the sites of the attacks, turning them into memorials. Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg's words during this time captured the nation's sentiment. "We will not let fear break us. We will not let fear silence our democracy." Permanent memorials were later established to honor the victims. On Utoya Island, a poignant site known as the Memory Wound was created. Our thoughts go to the victims' families. May they all rest in peace.